Hey everyone, and welcome back to this deep dive. We're going to be wading into a really interesting area, the world of medical records, specifically where those records run right into legal scrutiny.
It's definitely a critical intersection, and honestly, a lot of folks just don't realize how much weight those records actually carry.
Yeah, you got that right.
Yeah.
And to get us started, you've provided us with some fascinating material. We're talking an analysis of a hospital's record-keeping practices, some real court cases, and even some scholarly articles that kind of unpack the whole legal side of this.
It's a rabbit hole for sure.
It really is. So today our mission, if you choose to accept it, is to try to figure out how something as simple as a medical record can end up having huge legal consequences, especially when we're talking about records that are incomplete or inaccurate.
And that happens more than you might think.
Right, so let's jump right in and start with that analysis of the hospital's records.
Yeah.
They use these two categories to check the quality of their records.
Yeah.
One's legitimacy, which looks at, is it legally sound, who wrote it, all that, and the other's content. So that's all about how easy is it to get to the information, how readable is it, and is it complete? So, the hospital had some big goals.
Who doesn't?
Right. They wanted to improve patient care, protect privacy, get some solid data they could use for research, and of course, follow all those regulations.
Ambitious for sure.
Totally.
Yeah.
And, on the surface, these categories seem pretty straightforward, like almost boringly bureaucratic. But when you dig into the analysis, it turns out there were some pretty big problems. And that's where things get interesting.
Oh, yeah. That's where the rubber meets the road.
So lay it on us. What kind of problems are we talking about here?
Well, in that legitimacy category, one of the biggest things they found was a lack of physician signatures on really key documents. Like, get this. The authorization for hospitalization forms only scored at 2.66 out of 10 when it came to having that all-important John Hancock.
Whoa. 2.66 out of 10. That is bad. Like, really bad. Makes you wonder what's going on in there.
Right.
Is it just people forgetting? Are the docs just swamped and rushing? Or is there like a deeper problem with the way the hospital's running things?
You've hit the nail on the head with those questions. Unfortunately, the analysis doesn't really go into the why behind those scores.
Right.
But it definitely raises a huge red flag.
For sure.
Those signatures, they're not just a formality. They're about accountability. Who's responsible for this patient's care? Without them, those documents might not even hold up legally.
So potentially a huge legal risk for the hospital. And what about content? What kind of issues did they find there?
Well, one of the biggest ones, this is really worrying, is that the hospital had a lot of trouble documenting the procedures that were the reason the patient was admitted in the first place. I mean, think about it. You open up a patient's chart, and you can't even tell why they're in the hospital in the first place?
Yeah, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
For the patient and the hospital both, what kind of impact could something like that have on patient care down the line?
For one, it totally messes with the continuity of care. Imagine another doctor, say the patient's primary care physician, trying to figure out what's going on with their medical history without knowing why they were in the hospital in the first place. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Yeah, you're flying blind, basically.
Exactly. It could lead to misdiagnoses, unnecessary tests, even treatments that could actually harm the patient because you're missing that crucial information.
Makes sense. And I bet it would also cause a huge headache for insurance companies and billing.
Right. Oh, absolutely. The insurance companies, they need those records to figure out if the hospital stay was really medically necessary. If the documentation's all vague or incomplete, it could mean denied claims, delayed payments, just a whole mess for everyone. It adds this whole financial burden on top of everything else.
So it's not just about the care they got in the hospital. It's about the long-term impact on their health and even their finances.
That's the thing. It all connects. One little oversight in those records can have consequences that ripple out way beyond that initial hospital visit.
We're talking like a butterfly effect almost.
Yeah.
And we haven't even gotten into the legal side of things. If the records don't clearly say why the hospitalization was needed, that could open up the hospital and doctor to all sorts of legal challenges, especially if someone starts asking whether the care was even necessary in the first place.
It's true. It's like they're putting themselves in a position where they have to justify everything they did after the fact. And without good records, they're fighting an uphill battle. It's like building a house on sand. It might look okay for a while, but eventually it's all going to come crashing down.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So it seems like we've stumbled into a whole hidden world of complexities within these medical records. They're not just forms, they're landmines.
That's one way to put it. And what's really fascinating is that this complexity, it touches on so many different parts of healthcare. We're talking patient care, medical ethics, legal liability, even the financial stability of the whole system.
Wow, it's all connected.
It really is. And it just goes to show that we can't think of these records as just some administrative chore. They're a vital part of this whole big ecosystem, and their impact goes way beyond just the individual patient or the doctor.
So the bottom line here is that these medical records, they really matter. They're a big deal.
They are. And as we move into this future with all this crazy advanced medical technology and the legal landscape always shifting, being super careful about documentation is only going to get more important.
It's like the more advanced we get, the more important the basics become.
You got it. And you know what really stood out to me in this hospital analysis was this whole issue of informed consent. It's something that people often misunderstand.
Yeah, most people just think of it as signing a form.
Yeah.
But it's way more than that.
Way more. It's about this ongoing conversation between the doctor and the patient. It's about making sure the patient really gets what's involved in their treatment, the risks, the benefits, the alternatives, any potential complications.
So it's about giving the patient the power to make a real choice, not just getting their signature on the dotted line.
Right. And that's where good documentation comes in. It's proof that those conversations happened, that all the important information was shared, and that the patient's consent was truly informed. You know, they weren't in the dark.
And if we look back at those TCLE issues from the hospital report, it seems like they've got some work to do there.
Definitely. Those low scores suggest that maybe the information wasn't always complete, or it wasn't documented in a consistent way. That opens them up to legal problems, because now it's harder to prove that the patient really knew what they were agreeing to.
So it's like a domino effect. Bad documentation can make the informed consent shaky, which makes them more vulnerable to lawsuits.
Exactly. And this isn't just about protecting the hospital or the doctor. It's about the patient's right to decide what happens to their own body, to make choices about their own care.
It's about respect at the end of the day. And it shows how those medical records, they're more than just administrative tools. They're legal documents with real ethical weight. And their impact reaches way beyond the hospital walls.
They really do. And as we keep trying to navigate this complex world where healthcare and the law collide, those records are only going to become more crucial. But you know what? That's a conversation for another deep dive. Maybe one where we can really focus on the rise of electronic health records and all the challenges and opportunities that come with them.
I'm already hooked. Sounds like we've got a lot more to uncover in this fascinating world where healthcare and the law meet. But for now, let's bring it back to those specific findings from the hospital analysis and really dig into some of the most worrying areas.
Sounds like a plan. You know, it's wild how something as simple as a signature or a note in a chart can become this huge legal thing.
Right, like we were saying last time. The lack of proper documentation can actually flip the script.
Yeah.
And suddenly it's the doctor who has to prove they weren't negligent.
Yeah, the burden of proof shifts. It really shows how important those records are for doctors. You know, to show they did everything right.
So it's not just about taking care of the patient right then and there. It's about making sure there's a record that can protect both of them, the patient and the doctor, if someone comes back later and starts asking questions.
Exactly. And the case we talked about earlier, the Mandet-Conde case, it really shows this in action. The court didn't buy the argument that those missing records didn't matter, just because the doctor said they did everything right during the delivery.
It was like the court was saying, show me the proof. And without those records, it's impossible.
Right. The missing documentation made it seem like something could have been missed. Even if the doctor followed every rule, it's a tough lesson in how powerful a complete and accurate medical record can be when it comes to the law.
It also shows you that these records aren't just for the people inside the healthcare system. They can end up as evidence in court, scrutinized and interpreted by lawyers.
And that's where those articles you gave us come in. They really add to our understanding. They explain how those legal ideas like causation and omission actually play out in real medical malpractice cases.
Yeah, let's talk about those legal concepts a bit more. We mentioned causation before, but can you break it down for us regular folks, without the law degree?
Okay, so think of it like dominoes. In a malpractice case, the person suing the doctor is trying to show that something the doctor did or didn't do set off this whole chain of events that led to their injury. They're connecting the dots.
So like the doctor's action is the first domino and the patient's injury is the last one in the line.
Exactly. And causation is about proving those dominoes are connected. That one led to the next. Now, when it comes to missing documentation, it might not be that the missing note itself caused the harm, but that it made it harder to do something about the problem, or to prove later that the right care was given.
So it's not always a straight line, more like a ripple effect.
That's a great way to put it. And that's where this idea of omission comes in. Legally speaking, not doing something, like not writing down an important finding or procedure, can be just as bad as doing something wrong.
It's like they say the sin of omission is as bad as the sin of commission.
Right.
It's true for medicine, just like anything else.
Totally. A doctor has this duty to act in the best interest of their patients, and that includes carefully documenting everything. Their observations, diagnoses, treatments, how the patient responds. Not doing that can be a big problem, even if they didn't mean to do any harm.
So even if a doctor is super skilled and knowledgeable, they can still get in trouble if they don't make a clear and complete record of what they did.
That's the reality, unfortunately. And it shows why documentation shouldn't be seen as a chore. It's a fundamental part of being an ethical and responsible doctor.
It's about protecting everyone involved, the patient and the doctor, making sure there's a clear and accurate story of what happened.
Exactly. And if we think back to that hospital analysis, it raises some serious red flags. Those low scores on things like doctor signatures and procedure documentation, they're painting a picture of potential trouble.
Like they're setting themselves up for legal problems without even realizing it.
And that brings us to another important legal idea from the articles: informed consent. If the information given during the consent process is incomplete or misleading, it can actually make the consent invalid, and that opens the door to lawsuits.
Yeah, a lot of people think informed consent is just about signing a form. But it's way more complicated than that.
Right. Oh, yeah. It's this ongoing conversation between the doctor and the patient. The goal is to make sure the patient really understands everything about the treatment, the risks, the benefits, other options they could choose, and any problems that might come up.
It's about giving the patient the power to make a real decision, not just getting a signature.
Absolutely. And that's where good documentation is super important. It proves those conversations happened, that the right information was shared, and that the patient's consent was actually informed. They knew what they were getting into.
And if we connect that back to those TCLE problems in the hospital report, it's pretty obvious they could be doing a better job.
Those low scores suggest that maybe they weren't always giving the full picture or documenting things consistently, and that's a legal weak spot, because now it's harder to prove that the patient was truly informed when they said yes to the treatment.
So it's like this chain reaction. Bad documentation weakens the informed consent, and that makes them more likely to get sued.
It's a slippery slope. And this isn't just about protecting the hospital and the doctor. It's about respecting the patient's right to make decisions about their own body and their own care.
It's about making sure they have a voice in what happens to them. And it really highlights how those medical records, they're more than just paperwork. They're legal documents with ethical implications. And their impact goes way beyond the hospital.
They really do. And as we keep trying to figure out this complicated world where healthcare and the law intersect, those records are only going to become more important. But, that's something we could talk about in a whole other deep dive. Maybe one focused on electronic health records and all the good and bad that comes with them.
I'd listen to that one for sure. Sounds like we have a lot more to uncover in this world where healthcare and the law meet. But for now, let's go back to those specific findings from the hospital analysis and really break down some of the biggest concerns.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so let's zero in on some of the specific problem areas from that hospital analysis. We've talked about the big picture stuff, legitimacy and content. But I'm curious about some of the individual findings. What really stuck out to you as a red flag?
Well, besides those crazy low scores on physician signatures, the thing that really grabbed my attention was the hospital's struggles with documenting the procedures that justified why a patient was admitted in the first place. It's like healthcare 101. And when it's not clear, it can lead to a whole mess of problems.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty basic question, right?
Yeah.
Why is this patient here in the hospital? But the analysis is saying that the hospital wasn't consistently giving a straight answer in their records. So what kind of impact can that have?
Just from a medical standpoint, it throws a wrench in the continuity of care. Think about it. A patient gets discharged. They go back to their primary care doctor. That doctor looks at the records, and there's no clear reason why they were in the hospital. It's just confusing. Makes it really hard to give good follow-up care.
It's like trying to read a book from the middle. You're going to miss a lot of important stuff.
Exactly. The primary care doctor might order tests they don't need, prescribe meds that clash with what they were already on, might even miss a diagnosis altogether because they don't have the whole story.
Wow, yeah, that's scary. And I bet it would create a nightmare for insurance claims and billing, too.
Oh, for sure. The insurance companies, they need those records to decide if the hospital stay was really necessary. Medically speaking, If the documentation is vague or incomplete, they might deny the claim or delay payment. It just adds a whole financial stress on top of everything else.
So it's not just about what happened in the hospital.
Hmm.
It can impact the patient's health and their wallet down the road.
It's all connected. A little mistake in those records can have consequences that reach far beyond that hospital visit.
It's like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
And then there's the legal side of things, too. If the records don't clearly show why the hospitalization was needed, that could lead to lawsuits, especially if there are questions about whether the care was appropriate or even if it was really needed.
It puts the hospital and the doctor in a tough spot. They have to defend their decisions. And without good documentation, they're in a weak position. It's like building a house on a foundation of sand. You know, it might look okay at first, but it's not going to last.
So this deep dive has really revealed a whole hidden layer of complexity within these medical records. They're more than just paperwork. They're like a minefield.
That's a good way to put it. And the crazy thing is this complexity. It affects so many parts of healthcare, patient care, medical ethics, legal liability, even the finances of the whole healthcare system.
It's mind-blowing how it all ties together.
It really is. And it just shows that we can't treat these records like they're just some boring task. They're a crucial part of the whole system, and they affect everyone involved.
It's like they say the devil's in the details.
And that's never more true than when we're talking about something as important as healthcare.
Absolutely. So the big takeaway here is that those medical records matter a lot.
They do. They protect patients, guide doctors, and help keep the whole system accountable and transparent. And as we've seen, even small mistakes can have big consequences.
So pay attention to the details, folks. They matter.
That's the best advice I can give. Stay curious, stay informed, and always remember those details. They can make all the difference, especially when it comes to your health.
And that's a wrap on this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us as we explore the often overlooked world of medical records. Until next time, stay curious and keep those deep dives coming.